Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming, particularly on a rather nasty weather day and at what, by Washington standards, is still a relatively early hour. So thank you for coming. I'm Michael Kugelman, Program Associate for South Asia with the Wilson Center's Asia program. We've been very fortunate over the last few months to have with us Pam Constable, who, as you all know, is the longtime Washington Post South Asia correspondent. She's been serving as a Wilson Center public policy scholar, working hard on a book project. And I emphasize the word hard. From the day she arrived, she's essentially been writing nonstop. It often seems like she closes herself in her office for about 20 hours a day, hard at work. But she'll be discussing this book project this morning, which presents a portrait of Pakistan from an angle that does not really emerge enough, and particularly in this country, and that's through the eyes of the country's people. It promises to be a very insightful and revealing read, though based on what I've heard about it so far, perhaps an unsettling read as well. So I'll not bother to read over Pam's bio, as you should have that information in front of you. Instead, I'll simply turn things over to Pam.
Good morning, and thanks for coming. It is indeed a nasty day out, so enjoy a few hours inside. I don't know if Mike is here, but I'd like to thank Bob Hathaway and Mike Van Dusen and the entire Woodrow Wilson Center for the opportunity to spend the past 4 months in this fantastic setting for study and research. I also want to apologize for being such a hermit and for missing out on so much of the collegial and stimulating environment here during my time. I simply had too much work to do, too little time, and I really had to keep my nose to the grindstone. So I hope none of you who are here from the center took it personally. I also want to thank the many Pakistanis, both at home and abroad, who have given me their time and insight to help me better understand their society and its problems. Second, I'd like to briefly explain what my project is and is not about. Please come in, welcome to sit. There's some chairs up here as well, and over here. It is not an attempt to analyze Pakistan's strategic relations with its neighbors or with the United States, or is it an attempt to rehash the debates over its political and military past, which have been written about by scholars and others for many years. It is rather an attempt to explain to Western readers what contemporary Pakistani society is like, what matters to Pakistanis, what fears and resentments and hopes they have, what forces shape their lives and opportunities and opinions, what inspires them and what holds them back. It is also an attempt to explain why Pakistan has struggled and often failed to reach its potential, to live up to the promise of its founding as a democratic Muslim nation. It is an exploration of what factors have prevented it from doing so, and an effort to show why they have made Pakistan more vulnerable to the pressures, threats, and influence of extremist Islamic groups today. This is far from a comprehensive survey, although I've traveled widely in Pakistan and met hundreds of people during many visits there over the past 12 years. There were important places I was not able to go, except very briefly, in particular Balochistan and Fatah. There were also many relevant people I was not able to interview in person, and I would simply mention two, Baytullah Masood and Muhammad Iftikhar Chowdhury. There is little in my book that will come as a surprise to most Pakistanis, and I am aware of the extreme sensitivity of many issues I will raise, and of the tendency to see foreign investigation or critique as anti-Pakistan. But I've also found that Pakistanis can be their own harshest critics, and I want to stress that the observations and conclusions in my study are products of my conversations and experiences there. When I set out to write a book on Pakistan, I did not want to breathlessly follow the latest news developments, but to focus on what was enduring in Pakistani society and on what was changing. However, it has proven very difficult to stay away from the news. Almost every day this summer and fall, there has been another breaking story related to Pakistan. Often these were developments that either advanced or changed subjects I thought I had already covered in the book. Just since July, for example, we have had the devastating monsoon floods, the WikiLeaks revelations, the increasing clash between the judiciary and the executive, and the 3-year extension of General Kayani's term as Chief of Army Staff, all of which have forced me to rip up entire sections of the book. Let me now try to lay out some of the fundamental points I make in this study, and then open up the discussion for what I hope will be a lively back and forth of questions and comments. Let me start with an aside on the floods, because in addition to being an overwhelming human and economic tragedy, this was also a crisis that reinforced or crystallized many permanent truths about Pakistan, and that thankfully contradicted a few stereotypes as well. I had not planned to return to Pakistan this summer because I was so overwhelmed with work. But after I read Daniel Moinuddin's haunting essay in the New York Times, which I recommend to everyone, about the plight of a village family in southern Punjab losing its only cow in the flood, I realized I could not write one more sentence about Pakistan without going back and seeing the damage for myself. So I returned in August, spent more than a week in Punjab and Sindh, visited a number of flooded areas as well as IDP camps. In addition to the suffering that resulted from the flood, what I saw and heard told me a great deal about the lives and problems of its victims before the flood. Many of these were poor and illiterate peasants at the bottom of Pakistan's socioeconomic ladder who had literally lost everything. The floods also reinforced the impression of a remote executive and an often dysfunctional state, with a president who chose to continue a vacation in Europe while the floodwaters were rising, although actually he did attend some meetings that were very important for Pakistan's economy, and an official response by civilian agencies that was often inadequate and chaotic. In contrast, the experience also reinforced the image of the army as the national savior, the only organized branch of government, an image that has long benefited the military establishment in Pakistan as it seeks to renew and extend its legitimacy as a major permanent actor in Pakistan's public life and official policy. By the same token, the swift delivery of emergency aid by certain religious parties increased the public's psychological association of them with charity and compassion. This phenomenon occurred earlier in the Kashmir earthquake, when Jamaat Islami workers rushed in to help the victims. This time the aid was mostly provided by Jamaat-ud-Dawa, a group that was spawned by one of the most violent jihadi organizations in the country, Lashkar-e-Taiba, but which has been working diligently to create an image of credibility and social relevance, for example, by championing Muslim rights in Europe and by protesting the diversion of water by dam building in India. In addition, some religious groups also claimed that the floods were a punishment from God because of Pakistanis' sins, a message that fit in with their militant crusade. The floods also reinforced a popular image of feudal landlords as selfish and powerful. There were many reports, some of which I heard firsthand, of rural levees being deliberately broken to divert floodwaters away from valuable private land. On the other hand, the good news was that the floods challenged the image of Pakistan as a selfish and stratified society where the rich pay few taxes and exploit the poor. On the contrary, there was a huge outpouring of financial and other kinds of aids from Pakistanis all over the country and in the diaspora, including the United States, from restaurant workers who delivered vats of food to people who were stranded, to doctors who volunteered at IDP camps, to businessmen who chartered rescue boats. The floods, please come in. There are a lot of chairs over on the right. Sorry, you're missing part of it. The floods, and especially the extent of hidden rural poverty and despair they revealed, shocked many people in Pakistan, as well as abroad. Suddenly, Pakistani businesses, from banks to cell phone companies, wanted to sponsor charitable appeals for safe drinking water or literacy campaigns, not just for flood relief. It became fashionable to pitch in. If there was a silver lining to this tragedy, that was it. Sorry. Now I'd like to take a moment to step back and make a few broader points about Pakistan today that I think are important and relevant to explore. I'm sorry I can't go into great detail in this short time here, but I'm happy to talk to anyone afterwards or at another time. I also want to say what an enormous challenge it has been to make sense of an incredibly diverse and complex country of more than 170 million people. A country that includes fashion models in Karachi, fundamentalists in Appara, barristers in Lahore, Bugtis in Quetta, Babus in Islamabad, brickworkers in Fatehjang, third-generation army officers, and 16-year-old suicide bombers. It is difficult to generalize. It is hard to avoid mistakes. And to paint such a broad canvas without offending at least some of the people some of the time is impossible. So, my apologies in advance. My first observation is about power. Pakistan is a country where many, if not most people, feel they do not have power. They have the superficial trappings of representative democracy, but in many cases they do not see tangible evidence of it in their own lives. They feel, to one extent or another, dependent on or at the mercy of forces more powerful than they. These forces can take many forms, whether they be landlords or mill owners, the police thana culture or the tribal jirga system, the intelligence services that harass troublemakers or critics, a court system that often sides with wealthy and influential parties, bureaucrats who expect bribes for services that should be free, or legislators who rarely see their constituents except on election day, or demand lifetime loyalty to get somebody out of jail. Because people do not trust the system, they feel they need protection and favors to get around it. As a result, everyone becomes an accomplice to corruption, especially its victims. This sense of powerlessness and injustice, which I heard from people everywhere I went in Pakistan, is a very important factor and perhaps the single most important factor in explaining the appeal of the Taliban and other religious extremists. They appear to offer justice in a society where that is very hard to come by, even if it is not always clear whether people understand what their brand of justice would look like or which version of Sharia they are talking about. They also offer an opportunity for people who feel excluded or hopeless, especially poor villagers in the tribal regions and unemployed youths in lower-class urban communities, to join a movement that has a powerful religious appeal as well as elements of a moral crusade or a social revolution, even if it looks like thuggery and terrorism from the outside. In case you're wondering, I will get to the case of Faisal Shahzad in a minute. A second observation I'd like to make is about truth. I've spent a great deal of time in Afghanistan, a place where much of what goes on is spelled out in black and white. Fight or die, eat or starve, guest or enemy, us or them. It is a place where people survive by making hard and sometimes violent choices, but they make them with defiant pride. In Pakistan, a lot of things are gray and murky. It is a place where people survive by playing the angles, cozying up, ducking their heads, or reinventing themselves. Truth is often elusive, elastic, and subject to endless political manipulation. Major political assassinations are almost never solved, be it Benazir Bhutto or MQM leaders, and there is often the feeling that it is politically convenient for them not to be solved. Court cases are chaotic affairs with dozens of versions of events, witnesses who can be bought and sold, suspects pressured to confess or recant, innocent people charged or released through bribes. Political promises are easily made and rarely kept. People of means are considered foolish if they admit their wealth and pay their taxes, creating a permanent culture of tax evasion. The current sitting president has been accused in numerous corruption cases, but never tried or convicted, so we don't know the truth, and we probably never will. In foreign affairs, central aspects of Pakistan's policies and behavior towards other nations are either covert, double-tracked, or routinely denied. For example, the long-time official fiction that Pakistan extended only moral and political support to the insurgents in Kashmir, or the recent official fictions that Pakistan does not accept American drone strikes on militant targets in Fatah. After the terrorist siege of Mumbai in late 2008, Islamabad denied for weeks that the sole surviving commando was a Punjabi linked to Lashkar-e-Taiba, even after he confessed and detailed evidence of this tie was produced. Despite numerous reports, including the recent WikiLeaks evidence, that Pakistan was maintaining links with certain useful Taliban groups, officials continued to deny it. The broader point here is that a society in which people at the top routinely prevaricate and obfuscate, hypocrisy becomes a way of life, and the state cannot expect or demand that ordinary citizens will behave honestly. In a society where political pressure and corruption filter down to the pettiest legal case or the smallest bureaucratic transaction, a government cannot ask its citizens to rise above this. When Pakistanis today quote Jinnah's speech in 1948 to the young civil servants of the day, calling on them to resist political pressure and serve the people fearlessly and honestly, they do so with sadness and shame. Again, I come back to the appeal of the Taliban and the religious extremists, to the puritanical ethos and simple verities of the militant mindset. When Mullah Fazlullah spoke over shortwave radio and called on the people of Swat to sacrifice their jewelry, throw away their television sets, and offer their sons to build a truly Islamic society, people listened. It was not until the real nature of this crusade came out, until fanatical vigilantes were killing policemen and tribal elders and school teachers and moderate clerics and singers, that they realized the truth. In war, especially a war of insurgency, the winning side tends to be the one with the most conviction, rather than the one with the most powerful weapons. Another topic I'd like to discuss has to do with the nature of Islam. Pakistan is not a theocracy, but it was founded as a Muslim nation. Its laws are written in conformance with Islam, and the vast majority of its inhabitants are practicing Muslims from one branch of Islam or another. Yet its citizens receive a barrage of confused and mixed messages about what it means to be a Muslim, and what is the correct meaning of crucial concepts like Sharia and jihad. What is the proper relationship between the state and religion? When there is violence against religious minorities, be they Shiites or Christians or Ahmadis, it is often not condemned wholeheartedly enough by the powers that be, and sometimes it is tacitly condoned. When terrorist attacks take place and innocent people are killed, officials and politicians, talk show hosts, and religious leaders often instantly cast blame on vague foreign forces and enemies of Pakistan, rather than acknowledging the menace of violent, homegrown extremism and extremists whose predations harm the society, the state, and the religion of Islam. When a militant group is banned and changes its name and continues carrying out acts of violence, when a militant leader is arrested and freed time after time, it sends a confusing signal to the public about what the state views as right and wrong. There are also influential opinion makers who deliberately conflate patriotism and national pride with unquestioned support for Islam, no matter what form it takes. Some of them seem to be seeking a clash of civilizations with the West rather than seeking to prevent it. As the late Benazir Bhutto said in the book released after her death in 2007, there are forces in Pakistan that have hijacked the true Islam, a religion of peace, education, and charity, for their own political aims. This deliberate conflation of religion and state, famously rejected by Jinnah in 1947, was brought back and promoted heavily during the Zia years and the Afghan jihad. It has continued to filter through society ever since, accompanied by an extraordinary proliferation of religious seminaries, of which there are now more than 20,000 across the country, teaching an estimated 2 million students. Many of these establishments are moderate and mainstream, but others are unregulated, unregistered nurseries of hate. Please come in. Because of Pakistan's continued fear and mistrust of India, its ongoing concern for the plight of Palestinians and other Muslim groups, and its complicated love-hate relationship with the West, there is sometimes an emotional defensiveness among Pakistanis today about Islam, and a reluctance to distinguish between the beliefs and the behavior of its extreme interpreters or violent enforcers. But as many Pakistani commentators have said, this distinction needs to be made loudly, clearly, and repeatedly. Teenagers in Wana or Mirali or Jang or Okara do not become suicide bombers because their parents take them to neighborhood mosques or teach them to say namaz and give zakat and learn the Quran and dream of going on Hajj and fast during Ramadan and celebrate during Eid. They become suicide bombers because someone evil tells them persuasive lies. This has nothing to do with Islam. Since the attacks of 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there has been a growing tendency towards a more muscular or religious conservatism among many Pakistanis, as well as among Muslims in other countries. Whether they be pop singers or cricket players or TV talk show hosts, a more strident defense of Islam and a more absolute rejection of the West. There is nothing wrong with promoting one's faith. The problem with this kind of proselytizing, which is based more on emotion than reason, is that it can easily slide toward the negative, helping to create what columnist Camilla Hyatt has called the Talibanization of the mind, an environment in which intolerance, hatred, and violence gradually become acceptable. Please, you can sit over on the right. There's still chairs. I'm sorry, I'm almost done. That is where the danger lies. That is how someone like Faisal Shahzad, an emigre from an affluent Pakistani military family, living a middle-class life in Connecticut, can be persuaded to plant a bomb in Times Square, just as easily as someone like Ajmal Kasab, an urban lower-class dropout with no prospects for the future and no heroes to follow, can be persuaded to launch jihad against the city of Mumbai. The last subject I want to talk about is change. For every enduring problem in Pakistan, be it feudalism or militarism, tribalism or jihadism, corruption or poverty or injustice, there are signs of change and pockets of hope. But not to mix the metaphor too much, the sword of change can also often be double-edged. The vast outpouring of charity and generosity after the floods was a very good thing, which surprised even Pakistanis themselves. The extraordinary drama of the lawyers' movement that restored the independent judiciary has led to the restoration of a Chief Justice who has been relentlessly crusading, even though he has sometimes gotten carried away, and his principles have unfortunately begun to blur into what looks like personal and political vendetta. There has been the remarkable rise of the independent media, especially private TV news channels. They have exposed scandals and emboldened critics and made officials more accountable than ever before, but they have often strayed into sensationalism and ad hominem attacks. And even though their influential hosts have sometimes pandered to public fears and prejudices rather than calling for reason, fairness, and objectivity. There's the increasing role of civil society, exemplified again by the lawyers' movements and the growing women's rights movement, which are finally beginning to spread beyond the educated elite. In towns and cities where I've visited all over Pakistan, there are lawyers and journalists and educators working very hard, often invisibly and sometimes in danger, to bring social justice and progress to people who have been neglected by the state, trapped by debt peonage, or imprisoned by tribal tradition. There is the influence of Sufi shrines and music and poetry, which have injected an element of compassion and serenity into a religious environment that could otherwise be distorted by hate, exclusivity, and aggression. There is an expansion of technology and higher education, which are belatedly beginning to trickle down to the working classes and expand opportunities for younger Pakistanis, offering an alternative to the rote learning of religious seminaries. There is the growing phenomenon of upstart and grassroots politicians, women and minorities and community leaders, who are becoming involved in politics and beginning to shake the apple cart of elite complacency at the top. But change is not coming fast enough. The majority of poor Pakistanis still feel excluded from political power, educational opportunities, economic prospects, and justice. As a result, they become accustomed to paying bribes instead of taxes. Instead of seeking help from the police, they attach their loyalty to a corrupt boss or a landowner or an M&A who will protect them against rival groups. They also look around for someone to blame for their plight, and it is all too easy for them to be persuaded that foreign enemies of Pakistan and Islam are the cause, when sometimes the problem starts at home. Former President Musharraf is now much discredited and ridiculed, and in some ways he turned out to be his own worst enemy. But he started out in power with some very good ideas that, for a number of reasons too complicated to explain here, he failed to pursue. But I remember a speech he gave in February of 2002, where he announced the ban of a number of sectarian and militant groups and declared that the true jihad must be against illiteracy, poverty, and injustice. I watched that speech, and I remember thinking at the time that he was right. Today, I think it even more. If Pakistan is to successfully fend off both the scourge of terrorist violence and the even more dangerous appeal of religious extremism, its leaders need to embrace the true spirit of Islam and the constructive meaning of jihad, to look in the mirror as well as shaking a fist across the water. Pakistan has often been called a failed state, yet it has more potential than most other developing nations in the world to thrive and progress, to become stable, prosperous, and yes, democratic. It will not achieve this by killing militants alone, by blaming foreign foes, or by letting the army take power again. It can only achieve this by investing in the future of an educated, employed, and engaged populace, rather than consigning the next generation of futureless children to make bricks, mop floors, or put on a suicide vest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pam. A lot of food for thought, very thoughtful comments. I want to open things up to all of you. So we're going to have a microphone going around. I wanted to recognize first, though, our resident Pakistan scholar, Huma Youssef. We wanted to give her an opportunity to ask the first question. So she's sitting right up here. Probably many of you already know her. She's a columnist with Dawn and a journalist, and we look forward to hearing her question.
Thank you, Pam, for a wonderful talk, and thanks, Michael, for this opportunity to ask the first question. I think that the project you've outlined is extremely important because there is this one narrative about sort of civilian government versus army rule in Pakistan that's been hashed out in many books, in many articles. It continues to be the narrative that I've heard since arriving in Washington that dominates discussions about Pakistan. And I think that your attempts to sort of unweave the social fabric of Pakistan, start talking about these cultural impetuses, truth, power issues that really dictate the way that people's lives are shaped. I think that this is going to help inform the debate about Pakistan, help people understand that sort of below these superstructures of army, judiciary, what the substructures are, what the pressures are at the sort of most grassroots level in Pakistan. So I thank you for working on a project that sort of aims to shift the conversation to the actual average Pakistani's daily life and pressures. One of the things I'm noticing in your talk and in several others is this almost schizophrenic description of the Pakistani people, on one side as a very passive people who are, you know, in these ties of sort of lost in this world of either blame or protection. Declan Walsh, who's another foreign correspondent, is also working on a book on Pakistan, and he's titled his book Inshallah Nation, which sort of really gets at this idea of this is a very passive people. They leave everything into the hands of gods. And you know, are not willing to sort of seize the day and take advantage of this. At the same time, he, like you, talks a lot about the potential of Pakistanis, their entrepreneurial spirit, the, you know, gusto of the women of the land. I hear a lot of this as well. And I'm sort of interested to hear a little bit more about this split and how it may have been a challenge for you to reconcile these two sides of the Pakistani population as you wrote. And I'd also like to hear a little bit about what you think about the conversation in Pakistan right now, on television channels, but also in the liberal Urdu and English language media, about how this is a nation in transition. There are regularly calls in the media, for example, for introspection, for revisiting of history by Pakistanis, for Pakistanis, a sort of reanalysis, a reinterpretation of our national identity, this whole wave of the two jinnahs, for example, the young jinnah, the old jinnah, the man in the suit, the man in the sherwani. And there seems to be this recognition within Pakistan that we are a society in transition with these two things. I'd like to hear how in your writing process and in your journalism you had to deal with this double-edged sword.
Thanks, Huma. I love that title, Inshallah Nation. I mean, there are a lot of sort of schizophrenic aspects to the society, as in fact there are in many. But the sort of the paradigm of passivity or activism, in some ways it's not a contradiction. I would say that from my own experiences, that Pakistanis are not passive at all. They're just not able to speak up and organize. They have very few avenues for speaking up and organizing. I mean, really since Bhutto, really since the 70s, there really have been very few organized, influential avenues for people to sort of speak up and express themselves. But when they get the chance, they do. I mean, there are little protests all over Pakistan all the time about everything, from food prices to you name it. It's not that they don't want to. I think that often people feel thwarted by, as I mentioned, sort of various forces in their lives, whatever it is. If it's the person who owns their land, or if it's the policeman on the corner, whatever it is, people feel they're not able to. So I don't think it's a contradiction. I think that you'd find that, again, looking at the lawyers' movement, again, looking at a number of things of people, protesting about sugar prices, for example, and electricity prices. I mean, there's a lot going on. It's just that I don't think people feel they have the outlet for it. So I think it's more like a lack of opportunity than a personality trait. On the issue of transition, I guess it's a bit more. I guess the answer would be more complicated. Yes, of course, it's a society in transition, and of course, the activism in the media and to a certain extent the judiciary and civil society is sort of pushing towards transition. And as I mentioned several times in my talk, introspection is incredibly important, and it's been a very big missing ingredient in a lot of the debate. But I also worry when you talk about the two jinnahs. It sort of makes me groan. It's like you ask someone a question about Kashmir and they have to start in 1947. You ask a question about Jinnah, they ought to start in 1930 or 1920. It's time to stop reinventing the wheel. It's time to stop sort of getting bogged down in historic debates. There's an identity issue. I understand that. It's something that I talk about quite a bit in the book, is sort of people aren't really still sure what Pakistan is, and I think that's very important. But I don't think it's as important as some other things. For example, leadership setting the tone and vision from the top. It's another. I didn't really talk about that, but it's a major factor. You don't need to rehash history if you've got sort of people sort of framing the debate and showing leadership and sort of saying, okay, what are we going to do now? How are we going to get these kids into high school? How are we going to get this water to this farm? How are we going to try and start really dealing with India? So I think that again, we're looking at activism and passivity here in a way. There are many reasons that are blocking these changes from happening, and I realize, of course, that particularly when you're dealing with foreign affairs, there are historical issues going way, 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 way back that still haven't been resolved. I'm aware of that. But I still would argue that if you really do try to reinvent the wheel and go back and sort of, parse the inner thoughts of Jinnah when he was writing X or Y speech, you're really not going to do much to help the transition.
Okay, I'm actually going to ask the first question just because you hit on leadership briefly. I wanted to push you on that just a bit. I think that many of the problems that you've laid out are rooted in governance issues, poor leadership, particularly an inability or a lack of desire of the country's leaders to take a sufficient interest in the betterment of the people. So my question is, based on your research, what kind of leaders do Pakistanis want? Do these leaders exist? Can they exist? If so, where should we look to find them? Can a special individual leader do the job, or do we need major structural changes in the country to allow for such leadership to arise?
At the risk of giving away the last page of my book, it's a quote from Abdul Sattar Edhi. He's really the closest thing. It's the curse of it's really the curse of Pakistan, that for a number of reasons, in a number of ways, leadership has been a huge problem for that country. It's a huge issue. There's bad luck. Good leaders have been killed. Good leaders have been forced out of office. That's sort of the curse of history. But beyond looking at individuals that for one reason or another were not able to stay in power or be in power, I think there's a vicious cycle at work in which, and again, I'm really focusing on now, this is not a historical project. People don't want to get involved in politics because for them it's synonymous with corruption and sort of elitism, and people don't. The participation in political parties is very small in Pakistan. I have a sentence in the book where I say something about the vast majority of people see politics as sort of a mud wrestling match between titans in the sky, rather than as something that they would actually be able to be involved in the way you or I would, or the way people in many underdeveloped countries that have stronger democracies would. It's really considered a game among elites rather than something in which you really want to get involved. So therefore, you don't get good material. You don't get good people rising up to run for whatever office it is. I'm just fascinated by this issue of Mr. Dasti and Muzaffargarh. And it's just, for those who don't know, there's this new phenomenon that's beginning of some of these sort of upstarts coming from way down the ladder who would never have gotten involved in politics or been elected before, and some people think they're thugs or unworthy, but some of them, they really are beginning to stir the pot in ways, and really are beginning. When you look at who responds to constituencies, look at the issue of constituent service. Who's really good at that? Sipah Sahaba. I would never, ever say that a country deserves the leaders it gets. But I would say that when the conditions are not there to produce what you might call genuine or well-motivated participation in the political system, you don't get the leaders you might. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's what I was thinking about when you asked it.
Okay. Please wait for the microphone to arrive, and then I ask that you give your name and your affiliation. Keep your question relatively brief. So let's start right in the back. Yep.
And I'm John Sewell. I'm a senior scholar here. It's a fascinating presentation, and thank you. I'm always curious about, in Pakistan, particularly the role of the outsider, because at least two-thirds of the people here are outsiders, i.e. they're not Pakistanis. And I'm struck with the contrast between Pakistan and Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a vibrant civil society. The government is almost irrelevant to what it does between the profit-making and non-profit sector. If you're an outsider, whether you're the Ford Foundation or USAID or the World Bank, is there an opportunity for taking advantage of this opening that you see in the result of the flood to help build up civil society? Because the problems you talked about of overall governance are very long-term in getting fixed. And yet we know from the record of economic growth, nobody grows unless they've got a committed group of leaders who want to inculcate economic growth.
It's a very interesting question. It's also sort of several questions rolled into one. I just wanted to briefly mention Bangladesh. I very deliberately in this study have avoided making comparisons between Pakistan and India because it's a slippery slope and only makes people upset. But I do make comparisons between Pakistan and Bangladesh because I think it's remarkable when you look at how Bangladesh was born and obviously the crisis that produced it. And when you see how far they've come and how basically they've done a lot with a little, to mention things that you could, coming out of the flood, microfinancing. And if you look, if you look at the Grameen Bank, the people it's helped are basically poor women. Poor women abound in these flood zones. So that's a perfect example of something. If you get a woman and you get her to you get her a new flock of goats and get her to pay back for those goats over a period of 10 years or whatever it is, I can't think of a better and more real way to not only help people after the flood, but also to begin some of the kinds of aid you're talking about. I know nothing about the delivery of aid. It's just not something that I'm familiar with. I do know that there are many projects across Pakistan. All kinds of organizations do all sorts of projects. I don't think there's a need, again, to reinvent the wheel here. I think it's really more a question of focusing on those that have proved to be reliable and honest and to be effectively delivering development aid and starting new ideas for people. That would be very, very useful thing. And as I mentioned, it just was amazing to me to see after the floods that people were already, by people I mean, was a Mobile Link, starts this campaign for, raising money for, the drinking water problem. The flood, I didn't say this in my talk, the flood was just so full of ironies. I drove into one district, I've forgotten the name of it, it was in southern Punjab, and totally inundated by floodwaters. And you ask the people, what's their major problem? No drinking water. So there you go. There are all sorts of opportunities that come out of a new awareness, as I said before, even within the society. So if drinking water can now be brought as a result of this crisis to districts that have never had it before, I think that's terrific. So I can't specifically answer your question, but I think generically, I think it's a wonderful opportunity.
Okay, let's come up to the front here.
Good morning. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I opened up the first Associated Press bureau in Pakistan 41 years ago, when everything you said today was applicable then as well. You have been in D.C., so you are aware of the workings of the United States government as far as Pakistan is concerned. How well do you think U.S. policymakers toward Pakistan understand the social and religious factors you're discussing today in making their decisions?
This is a very, very huge can of worms you just opened up, which I wasn't planning to get into. And my book, again, as I said at the outset, is not a book about U.S. policy. And I really, even though you're right, I've studied it a lot and read a lot about it, it's not something I'm really focusing on other things. But I would say two things. I would say there's sort of two answers to that question. I'm quite sure that officials here are very, very, very aware of everything, of all of Pakistan's problems. I have no doubt of that. The question is when that sort of concern comes up against other issues. This is a strategic situation. There is a war on terror. These are, this is a very complicated moment. And, let's just look at the drone attacks. Every time you ask a Pakistani official about drone attacks, they say, it's a terrible thing. America needs to understand our internal constraints. America needs to understand the domestic forces and opinions with which we have to contend. But in fact, they also know that something has to be done about these guys, and there are very few ways to do it. So, that's just one example of, what's the baby and what's the bathwater? This whole issue we had a talk here last week about what was going on in Fatah. The whole issue of still focusing on drones, tactical versus strategic. You kill 5 bad guys, do you create 100 more enemies? That's an open question. This is a very complicated subject you've raised. Another part of it is corruption. Because there's a great deal of corruption, and because there's a lack of accountability, but because they need help, and because if they don't get the help, there's going to be more militancy and more extremism, what do? Do you continue to give aid? This is often the case in places like Africa, with the whole issue of bringing in sustenance to people who need it, even when you know that chunks of it are going to the wrong place. How do you balance those decisions? I mean, you're really asking a very huge question, and there are many aspects to it. So I'm not really sure I can answer it concisely, and it's not something that I've been thinking through systematically. I'm just giving you a couple of off-the-cuff comments about issues that I see getting in the way of making those kinds of policy choices.
Okay, question of the woman in the back there. Yep.
Hi, my name is Jamie Dorner, and I'm a student at American University. First of all, thank you for coming. It was a great talk. But my question is actually derived from discussions with some of my professors. U.S. foreign aid that has been or had been evidently given to Pakistan had apparently not been seen by a lot of the Pakistani people, whether it be of the corrupt government or the fact that they don't want to give the Western world and the outside world credit for this aid. How do you think that this affects the Pakistani people's view of the Western world?
It's a really good question. I don't know if you're specifically talking about flood aid, but let me answer specifically talking about flood aid, because it's something that I noticed myself. The Americans have given a great deal of aid in the flood. I mean, the government and everybody I know has given something. But when I was in Pakistan in August, going to visit flood areas, many people I talked to, including journalists and educated people who follow the news, said, "Why isn't America helping us in the floods? Don't they want? I mean, do they want us to fail?" I heard that from quite a few people. Where is the aid? Where's the help? And the only thing I could answer to them was that, well, it's here, but I guess you're not seeing it. But I'm pretty sure it's here. There's again, we come into these, conundra in which, because of vulnerability to attack, you don't necessarily want to put a giant sign with an American flag on it saying, here's 5,000 tons of wheat. There are constraints. Also, I think there's been a lack of sort of an insufficient, public awareness campaign to let people know that aid is there. And also, a lot of the aid has not taken physical form. A lot of the aid has been sort of this, invisible stuff, strengthening bureaucracies and ministries, and there's all sorts of aid that comes in that you really can't show. But I also think there's been a failure of communication, and I think they just haven't done enough to let people know about it. But you're also not exactly, but potentially opening up this huge issue I have a whole chapter on this in the book, called "Why They Hate Us," and the perception of the West, and particularly of the U.S. in Pakistan, is very, very bad right now. And there are a lot of reasons for that, some of which, I think are accurate, and many of which I think are not accurate. But it's a huge problem, and it's getting worse, not better. And unfortunately, I think that a number of things that have happened here lately, including the sort of very ugly debate over putting an Islamic-related religious center near the World Trade Towers, and a number of other things that are going on, are fulfilling some of the prejudices and the worst stereotypes that people in Pakistan have about the West. So this is an ongoing problem. It's not getting better, and a lot needs to be done to improve, I hope, what people in that country think about people and policies in this country.
Yes, I think that's Dennis back there against the wall, right next to the Woodrow Wilson picture.
Standing in the shadow of the great man, or sitting. Dennis Cooks from the center here. I wonder what your talks with people, Pam, revealed about the struggle going on, if you will, for the Pakistani soul between the Sufi tradition and the Wahhabi or Deobandi tradition.
That's another great question. I actually have 2 whole chapters on that issue. It's very, very, very important. I wrote a piece about it actually in the Washington Post a couple of months ago. There have been a number of attacks on Sufi shrines. Apparently, there was another one yesterday. One of my favorite Sufi shrines. It's just, you know, it's a complicated question. Sufism is sort of the, I don't know what to call it, the refuge of Pakistanis. Sufi shrines are amazing places, and I started going to them because anybody's allowed to go, which is not true of many religious places in Pakistan. And so I actually try to go to as many as I could. I've been to, I guess, maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15, some of them repeatedly. Because they are places where really anyone is welcome, and all sorts of crazy people go, but, you know, they're wonderful. Big caveats, there are plenty of, you know, corrupt and nasty Sufi business people and political leaders, but we're talking about Sufism here. I mean, oh God, these are such complicated questions. You know, in a way, it's a continuum. In a way, you know, way over here on the right, you've got the Taliban. You've got the very extreme Salafists and Wahhabis who have this very rigid, very puritanical, you know, vision of what Islam is, particularly regarding women and other issues as well. And then sort of way over here, you've got Sufism, you've got sort of much more, I mean, I don't want to say liberal, but tolerant ideas about Islam. You know, most people sort of fall somewhere in the middle. It's very hard to say these things in a simple, in a sort of a short way. It's the continuum that interests me, not the ism. You know, I remember I've met so many people. I remember I was in Lahore one day, and I'd been to hear Hafiz Saeed give his Friday sermon, and then after that I went around the city, just going to various mosques, community mosques, and talking to people, and asking them about Islam. And I went to this one community mosque, and I met the imam. He was a very nice guy. He invited me for lunch, and he was rather conservative, and his sermon had also been very anti-American, anti-drone attacks. There was a big drone attack, and there was all this sort of anti-Western stuff. But I went inside, and I met his family, and he had 2 daughters in college. One was getting an engineering degree, and one was getting, I don't know what, political science degree. It was a very conservative family. But the girls were very proud of their education. They also wore hijab when they went out. They covered not their eyes, but they wore very complete, you know, almost complete hijab when they went out. And they were complaining they couldn't get jobs in the public education system because of that. I just remember that conversation because it said so many contradictory things at the same moment about that particular family and where they saw themselves on the continuum of religion and you know, what's good and bad, what's extreme, what's not. I've also spent quite a bit of time in a Barelvi mosque whose founder was assassinated. I got to know his son fairly well, and which is a sort of a mainstream Sunni mosque. And we were having, you know, very relatively progressive. The father was a very famous Muslim scholar who had issued fatwas against suicide bombing and was, you know, famously opposed to the Taliban, but also anti-American. And, you know, the son, very progressive, you know, very sort of, you know, let me talk to any students I wanted to. It was very strongly about, tolerance, and the Taliban are wrong. They're not Islamic. We don't believe in this sort of the Emir and violent jihad. And yet, very critical of and mistrustful of American motives and of Americans and of thinking that the West is trying to take over Pakistan. I mean, so none of these things are mutually exclusive. Many opinions and many views coexist within mosques, within imams, within families, within people of all kinds. There's talk about transition. I would say that the very notion of Islam is in flux in Pakistan, with many players, good and bad, with many opinions floating around, good and bad. I think it's a very important time for that reason. But I don't think it's a battle between good and evil necessarily. I don't think that the isms, whether it's Brelviism or Wahhabism or Sufism or Salafism or whatever it is, I don't think the isms are what really matter here, as much as trying to find and develop a society in which, all views can be tolerated as long as you're not killing people, which is really what it comes down to.
Okay, yes, right up front, Bill Milam.
Thank you, Pam. That's a great talk, and I think, if you had a pile of books there, you'd sell them out right now. So
come back.
Oh, believe me, I will. I wanted to go back to the floods for a moment to remind you of an article I saw, I think, on the BBC website about a week ago by a guy named Makbul, who was talking to people along the flood route, and who talked to one landowner who he asked, well, what do you think caused these floods? And the owner said, in all seriousness, as far as I could tell, India.
Right.
Now, India had, for this particular person, some sort of supernatural power to direct the monsoons, and make them heavier and so forth. I won't go any further into that, but this whole India phobia, or India centricity as I call it, has always been one of my particular bugaboos. And I guess the question is, in all of your interviews and all of your talks, do you see that as something that can change, and do you see it as a change that follows, shall we say, a change in social mentality? In other words, will people change other things first? Will governance get better? Will people start paying taxes first and all of that? Or is India centricity sort of a central key to how Pakistan is going to get along better in the world? So this is the question that fascinates me, because I consider this as one of the major problems with Pakistan, and yet I see no way of changing it in particular, and particularly since there are many, including the military, who have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are. So what's your view?
Well, I mean, you're right on point. India phobia is a top-down phenomenon, not a bottom-up phenomenon. It has nothing to do with poverty or social problems. It has everything to do with defining yourself in a negative way, defining yourself as being against something else. And in frankly not becoming secure enough to overcome something. I don't think it's just about the army getting toys. It's much more than that. It's in the water, it's in the air. It's been there a long time. It's going to stay a long time. And it won't start getting out of the water and the air until the state says, okay, no more. We're going to fix this. We're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to do something about this. Now, it's not an easy thing to do. We all know how complicated it is, the role of the United States, yes or no. India, I don't think India wants to take over Pakistan any more than I think the United States of America wants to take over Pakistan. But then again, we're not neighbors. So that one matters much more. I just think this is, I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, but I can't at the moment. If you look, I've read a lot about this because I've been trying to really understand why it's there. Amir Mir, who wrote this incredible book about the jihadi groups, has a great sentence where he says, Homo Pakistanus has been bred to believe that India is the permanent enemy. It's just, that's it. It's in, as I say, it's in the water, it's in the air, it's in the blood. Short answer is it will not start getting out until policymakers decide to start changing it, both in Pakistan and in India and elsewhere. I just, when I was in Agra when President Musharraf went, and I think it was Vajpayee. It was Vajpayee. And, we thought for about 5 minutes that something was really going to change. And then, of course, the hawks on both sides pulled back. And these are the mud wrestling gods way above our heads. This is not going to change until those gods just start deciding that it has to change, and that it's better for all of them to get along than not to get along. I have no idea if that will ever happen.
Okay, right here, question.
Marvin Weinbaum, Middle East Institute.
Welcome.
Pam, back to the floods again. There were many people when the floods really, the devastation was clear and the extent to which this was going to disrupt so much of the country and perhaps economically pull it down, said this is a game changer. This could be the beginning of something big. It hasn't turned out that way at all. If anything, it's reinforced the idea of the resiliency of whatever this is. Can we explain that? I know you before talked about the fact that people view politics as something for someone else. But the kind of change that I think some were looking for here was much more on a mass scale. It didn't have anything to do with political parties, but that there would be riots over food, and that this would take on a life of its own. Again, we haven't seen it. Maybe we will. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can we understand this?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very, 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 very hard to spend time in and writing about Pakistan without becoming cynical. Cynicism is the national disease, and it's a killer. You just don't want to believe anything you hear because you're going to find out 5 minutes later that it's not true. It's very tough. It's a very tough place to work and maintain some sort of sense of hope for change because nobody around you thinks it's possible. And because, as I said in my talk, the victims become the accomplices. That's the real problem. I was thinking of a couple of things when you were talking that I observed at the floods. One of them was I went to an IDP camp I'll tell you about 2 IDP camps I went to in Sindh. In one of them, it was full of all sorts of people who turned out not to be from the flood at all. And some land mafia guy had sent them there to sort of pose as flood victims, because of all the help they were getting. That's why I say it's cynicism. It's really hard not to. The other one, which is even more interesting, was that I went to another IDP camp where there was absolutely nothing. People were just sitting in the mud. They had nothing. And this was a camp that had been set up by one of the Sindhi nationalist parties, but they hadn't done anything for the people. They were all just sitting there. And I observed 2 things in that camp. One, no school had been set up of any kind. The kids had absolutely nothing to do. And over in the corner, there was a guy in a white tunic and a green turban, and he had brought 1,000 copies of children's Quranic study guides and had herded all the kids into a tent and was teaching them Quran. Number 2, I walked up and down the rows of the tents. There was just people literally sitting in the mud. And I found, this is really sad, I found this woman, and she she was just sitting there, surrounded by little kids, nothing to do, and right in the middle of her filthy tent was a really nice textbook in English that said something like, how to learn English easily. Very simple book. And I opened it up, and there was like, how to brush your teeth. I mean, it was a literacy guide for adults in third world countries. And my face lit up, and I said to this woman with my translator, "Is this your book?" And she said yes. And I said, "Are you using it?" And she said, again through the translator, "Yes, I bought it to wrap pakoras in the pages." Because I'm going to sell them door to door, which actually wasn't a bad thing. I mean, she was using it to the best that she could. So I'm not really answering your question, but it's very easy to get cynical about just about everything. And I want to go back to something that Huma was asking about. There weren't giant food riots, but there have been small ones. In Baracao, I went to some food riots. But actually, they were electric riots. But in any case, people were upset, and they were coming out, and they were letting it be known that they were upset about the unbelievably criminal. I mean, if you spend 3 rupees to take a bus every day to your job, and the price goes up to 6, that is double. And then you find out that the driver, again, I'm getting cynical, that the driver actually is substituting a certain kind of fuel for another in order to get more money and still charging the people double. So people get upset. They do protest. There are little protests all over Pakistan all the time. The issue is, as you raised before, having it sort of coalesce, the coalescing or the encouragement or the growth. Civil society, as I said just in a throwaway phrase in my talk, has always been the province of the educated elite. I mean, going out on the street to complain about something is still something that most poor Pakistanis don't feel free to do. Not very often, not very much, and not very big, but they do it. So I'm rather hopeful, actually, about that phenomenon. I don't think the floods are a game changer. I don't think they're going to cause some sort of sea change in the way people think or act. But I do think that everything is incremental, and when people do see others beginning to do things, then they become willing to step out. I mean, this is a national security state with a lot of really nasty people in it who have an awful lot of power. Are you going to get out there in the street and say, "I want this"? The fact that people do it all is a good thing, and I think it's going to continue to grow, but in slow ways.
Okay, let's go to this gentleman here against the wall.
Thank you. My name is Essen. I'm not representing any organization. I'm here in a personal capacity, plus with great interest in your reporting. And you have given a very honest picture of Pakistan. And I myself spent about 6 months. And by the way, I'm not a Pakistani. I'm Indian Muslim originally. So what I say, but still, the time I spent in Pakistan was fantastic. It was the most pleasant. And I do agree, you have said many negatives about Pakistan, but there are lots of Pakistan, especially at the people at the grassroots level, so sincere and so meek, in fact. I think, and that's one of the advantage the politicians are taking in terms of the meekness of the people, the hospitality, and I think you touched on the generosity also. And what your report indicates is, in Robert Frostworth, that we have a lover's quarrel with Pakistan. And I have the same feeling too. And my question to you is on what is the role of the NGOs? Are they playing any positive roles? I know about Idi Foundation, which is doing remarkable work, and he needs to be nominated for the Nobel Prize because he takes no money from foreign sources, and it's only on the generosity of Pakistan. He runs a fantastic organization. So the role of the NGOs. And also, as for the corruption, when Pakistan have hanged prime ministers and killed prime ministers, I don't know why Mr. Zardari has been spared. As they say that the fish stinks from the head. And do you think he will be spared in times to come with more democratic movement or more the independence of the judiciary? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. So it's two different issues. The issue of let me take the last thing first because it's the most important, I think. Certainly he should be spared, and the country will be more powerful for it, and democracy will be more powerful for it. I have a sentence that I wrote yesterday, actually, that says, it's a sad commentary, but it may be that if Asif Ali Zardari gets to be able to show his elected successor around the presidential palace, it might be the most important accomplishment in Pakistan's political history. I haven't written the book yet, but that's the sentence that I wrote, so I may change it, but I wrote that sentence. It's like anything else, you know. A mediocre or corrupt or incompetent or venal or philandering democratically elected president is much better than the alternative. Especially now. So yes, I certainly hope he's spared. And I do think he will be, because I think this fight that's going on with the judiciary, I mean, I don't know where it's going to lead, but I think that, for lack of a better word, and I don't have one yet, the establishment has decided that he's going to stay. So I think he probably will stay. You know, I wish Benazir hadn't been killed, and I don't know what would have happened had she survived. I thought about it a lot, actually, how different things might have been, or would they have been, what lessons she might have learned, how changed she might have been as a leader, you know, how much baggage was she still carrying, you know, who still had it in for her. Obviously, they succeeded. How much of a blow that was, how much of a setback that was. You know, but even though he is an accidental president, you know, very unsuited for the job, has huge cloud over his head, it's very important for the office to be respected, and I think that's what matters most at this point to Pakistanis. But let me just quickly say something about NGOs. As I mentioned, Edie is my personal hero, and I actually he was the last person I interviewed in Pakistan for the book, and I spent a day, and you know, he has this little office in the middle of cluttered, moldy labyrinth, and he is surrounded by, it's a fascinating organization, not only because people admire it so much and because it has a substitute for a lot of unavailable public services, but because the people who volunteer there are also mostly poor, mostly also urban poor, mostly men, but also there's some girls' projects as well that have women. But you see these people sitting around, talk about engagement, the pride. You know, they wear these little yellow jackets, and, you know, there's this amazing pride that he has helped to instill in people that are supposedly passive, or whatever you want to call them, according to, you know, various accounts. But boy, you see them getting out there. They're driving ambulances, they're cleaning things, they're delivering food, they're doing all sorts of stuff. I was incredibly impressed by that, by the spirit of the organization, and by, I think, the example that it is setting for Pakistan. And there are other smaller ones and others that have a similar services that are provided. But it was the ethos, I think, of that group that I found very hopeful, and hopefully can set an example.
I'm Rob Cortell, CEO of a company named Intellix, which is a software technology company in Northern Virginia. A minute of context and then the question. And part of the context is I sit on a special Middle East working group at Aspen. I have a very successful project in Jordan with about 200 Jordanian Arabs working there. And we've just recently been awarded a major USTDA grant in Pakistan based on the previous one. So I now have a team in Karachi looking at congestion management in the port and the AFPAC deal. And I just returned from Turkey talking to political leaders. So there is a lot of similarity in a lot of the issues in these conversations. And I'm really here today because of my team on the ground in Pakistan, which includes Pakistanis. And I'm always grateful that we were born as a nation during the Enlightenment, not some other time. In each of these countries, and I think I see the same thing in Pakistan, the business community is always left out. You know, this is a great conversation. It's a terrific presentation. I can't wait for your book. I'm going to call you for lunch anyway, because context is very important. But the business community just goes on a parallel track, and they admit it. Part of that is because I think a lot of them are practical. They tend to be less religious in all of these countries. They tend to be a little more clear-eyed about what their goal is, which is money. For example, I just entertained a group of senior Pakistani businessmen here about 4 weeks ago, just before I went to Turkey. And they didn't want to go to a Pakistani restaurant. They wanted to go to a good Indian restaurant. So I took them over to the Bombay Club, and they had a great meal, and half of them drank, and they were all Muslims, and half didn't.
Food's better at Ravi Kebab.
Yeah, Ravi Kebab. Actually, I really like Bombay. Actually, Rasika is my favorite Indian right now. And I had this conversation with the Palestinian leadership, you know, the prime minister and the president. They totally ignore the business community. And the business community constantly looks for ways around the political apparatus. And the way it plays out in Palestine and in Israel is that they find ways to cross the border even when they're not supposed to. They make deals across the border with the Israelis. Mm-hmm. The Pakistani business community makes deals with the Indian business community. So comment on that. Where are they? Why are they ignored? What is going on? And by the way, I will say that to a person at that dinner a month ago, they all preferred a military government. Yet they absolutely were educated in the West. They liked democracy, and they knew the hazards.
That's what's so sad, is that they don't think there's an alternative. That's really.
But it's real.
Yeah, this is a huge topic. I guess I'm interested in the phrase "left out." Exactly what you mean by that. But do you want to add something to this question, sir?
No.
You're just. There's somebody behind you raising their hand. I just don't know what is going on.
I would like to reinforce that question, asking if you can't answer it, someone else in this room might. Where's the economic program for the reconstruction and development? I'm an advisor to my name is Charles Constable. I'm an advisor.
Could you use the mic, please?
I'm an advisor to the Pakistani Board of Investment for the last 18 months. I haven't seen a single project that I've been able to put together or find or hear about or read in your newspapers. So would someone, if you can't create jobs, all your other efforts in civil society aren't going to succeed. So please address that issue.
Yeah, this is a vast topic that it's not, again, one of my focuses, but I just make a couple of comments. One is bureaucracy. The bureaucracy in Pakistan is mind-boggling, and a lot of people I know that have tried to start businesses or grow businesses or open businesses have complained bitterly that they basically were literally not able to, because they couldn't get through the thicket and the obstacles and the problems that were presented by them. And again, it's not my field, but I've had people describe a situation in which that the bureaucracy exists not to encourage, but to find ways to stop and even undermine foreign investment. I've heard business people complain about that to me. It's not a field I've studied. I'm just telling you it's something people have said to me. I was thinking in particular about what was southern Punjab. You know, it's very, very dry, and I remember I went to visit a sugar mill there, and I was talking to some people there about why there isn't more industry down here. Why don't they've got all sorts of crops and mangoes and sugar and everything. And why isn't there, the whole issue of value added? Value added is very important for a country that has mostly still producing mostly raw material, still mostly just sending, cotton instead of, clothes and, and again, I don't know about this, but I'm having to answer your question. Somebody said, yes, a long time ago somebody came. I don't know if it was Tropicana. I don't know who it was. Some big company, Cargill. Somebody went in there 10, 20 years ago with a huge plan to develop agribusiness, to develop processing plants of all kinds, value added, and they couldn't get through the bureaucracy and they left. Plus somebody wanted too much money for the land and it had to do with some political dispute, and they gave up because the obstacles to doing honest business were too great. That's the story that I got. And I don't know who it was, and I don't know anything about it. But I remember thinking there was the list of things that got in the way. The powers that be, the bureaucracy, the landowners, everything that happened to this company basically said, forget it. Probably just some M&A opposed it. They couldn't get through all. So that's number one. Number two, and this is a whole other can of worms, and that is, the philosophy of business. When all those charges were brought against the Sharifs and Ittihad and all the factories and all the loan defaults and that whole scandal of these huge, giant ghost factories, loan defaults, this whole big scandal, it was wrong. But it was more than wrong. It was short-sighted. You don't run a factory into the ground. What good does it do anybody? You just get back your $1 million. What does it do for anyone? If you're not willing, as I said in my little last sentence, to invest in an engaged, employed, and educated populace, what are you doing except building another damn mansion in Dubai? And who is benefiting from that? This society is not. It has to do with the attitude and the philosophy that goes into building a business as you build a nation. It ought to be an investment in the future. The pie ought to be growing. And if you don't think the pie ought to grow, and if you just want your little piece of it, you, writ large, will not get ahead. And I don't know if there's a new way of thinking. I don't know if there's a transition in that community. But I have met a few business people that I think are investing in the future of Pakistan. But I've also seen a lot of enterprises that have been described to me as simply robbed blind, rather than improved. And I think that's a huge problem.
All right, we've got time for 2 more questions. So the first one is going to be right here, the woman in the black sweater. Had your hand up a while.
Thank you. I'm Ann Sweetser. In the spirit of asking you all sorts of questions about elephants in the room that are not what you wrote on, why is Pakistan not thinking more about China? 2 years ago, there were 80,000...
Pakistan loves China.
Well, but uncritically. I mean, I just wanted to raise that.
Yeah, it's not my field at all.
Did you hear
ask
anything?
Mowahed, his brother, is the king of China. Ask the question to him.
Okay. Let's go to you first, sir, and then I think we'll have time for one more quick question. But the gentleman in the purple shirt over here.
Thank you. I'm Gautam Adhikari, former Indian journalist, currently with the East-West Center.
In Honolulu?
No, here.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was going to say, long flight.
Yeah, I'm here. Do you see any long-term prospects, sort of sustainable prospects for genuine democracy taking hold in Pakistan? Somewhat like what happened in Bangladesh, where the army actually successfully was driven back to the barracks. That's one example where...
Bangladesh is ethnically unified.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like Cuba. I mean, Pakistan is like 10 countries. So much, much, much harder to, to make that work. Yes, I do. For a variety of reasons. Boy, the people are asking these broad.
No, I had a specific point why I asked that, because
do you want to make the point?
Well, it's that, it's Bill Malam's point, actually, that much of the, obsession with India, the identity of Pakistan as anti-India, is reinforced by the army. And it was so even when Bangladesh was under military rule to a great extent. And that has started dissipating in Bangladesh very much. And in fact, when a businessman was in power in Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, I think, well, there are many critics he has, but that was the time when the Lahore Declaration was signed, and there was genuine prospects for opening up between India and Bangladesh. And then came Kargil under Musharraf. So the reason I'm asking is that maybe is that the kind of key to changing the identity of Pakistan as seen by Pakistanis?
It's the key to changing a great deal, and until that relationship is fixed, I think there are many things that won't change. But I don't think it's necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily a necessary condition for the promotion of democracy. I mean, I think, Pakistan has had a lot of ups and downs and backs and forths, but there are improvements. We do see change coming. We do see the strengthening of democratic institutions. I think that process will continue, even though the hostile relationship with India continues to exist. I also think that, yes, at some point you get these sort of parallel trends taking place. Eventually they will converge, and eventually, yes, I'm sure that by the end I know Zardari tried. I know he tried, and I realized that there was another moment there, and he got pushed back. But I do think eventually there will be leadership in both countries that wants and is able to change things. And I don't think that it necessarily has to be a civilian leadership, A. And B, I don't think that relationship will necessarily thwart the inevitable and gradual movement towards better democracy.
Bob Hathaway has the last word.
Oh.
As he typically does.
Michael, would you clarify? That's a good thing, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
We will not call him the Helen Thomas of the...
Pam, you are leaving us later this week, which we regret. I think your presentation today simply underscored the wisdom we displayed in inviting and hosting you here. We very much look forward to this book, and I want to issue an invitation right now, once the book is out, to come back to talk more about it, and perhaps we'll even help you sell a few copies. It is really a terrific presentation. I've been visiting Pakistan, worrying about Pakistan, trying to figure Pakistan out for 25 years now, and yet I was struck by how many things you said today simply sort of put things in clearer focus for me, so I really look forward to the book. Since it's after 11, I'm actually not going to ask a question, but I am going to tell you the two questions I might have asked you. Maybe we'll talk about them afterwards. One is, I'm a great believer in a comparative approach. You've spent so many years in Latin America. Had we had time, I was going to invite you to compare the people of Pakistan to the people of various parts of Latin America, specifically with some of the characteristics you referenced about Pakistanis, the sense of powerlessness. Some people, you didn't use the word, I don't think, but some people have seen a fatalism in Pakistanis. And I wonder if this comparative approach helps us better understand Pakistanis by looking at other peoples who may or may not share some of the same characteristics. But subject for another discussion. The other thing that I was going to ask you was to reference the fact that Pakistan has a huge bulge in its youth population. The youth of Pakistan, for better or for worse, really are the future of the country. So vigorous discussion whether or not youth represents a potential for progress, for good, or whether they're something of a ticking time bomb. But again, for the next discussion, I was simply going to ask you to compare the youth of country to the country at large. Are the youth angrier? Are they more tolerant? Are they more religious-minded? Are they more progressive or conservative? Because I think when we start to describe the youth, we really do have a clearer sense of what may lie in future for the country. Anyway, we won't go any of these ones today. I just want to say again how much we've enjoyed having you here and how much we look forward to having you back to talk about this book once it's in print. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I reiterate that. Thank you all for coming.
For anybody is curious about it, I read the speech that Ayub gave and the speech that Musharraf gave when they took power were almost identical to the speech that Pinochet gave when he took power.